Vietnam War 1968 lasting impact. On January 30th was the beginning of the Lunar New Year festivities known as Tet in Vietnam. Villagers were taking advantage of the week-long truce made because of Tet. There were many funerals held that week for the fallen soldiers. However, the coffins held weapons instead of people. The villagers were also Viet Cong agents. That night, they attacked 100 small towns and 12 U.S. air bases, killing 5 Americans. The Tet offense continued for a month until America and South Vietnam gained control again. America's opinion changed, and many people thought that we should have never sent American troops to Vietnam. After this, Johnson withdraws from the presidential campaign because many people blamed him for the war. He also blamed himself for this war and could not bring himself to run again. Americans were also in shock not only from the war, but the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. Then there was also the assassination of Robert Kennedy, who had become a strong candidate in the Democratic primary. On top of all this, college campuses continued to protest. Almost 40,000 students on more than 100 campuses took part of these protests. Most of these protests were started against the war. One example of these protests is at Columbia University in New York, when police had arrested 900 protesters to calm things down. Since Johnson was stepping down and Kennedy was assassinated, Eugene McCarthy and Herbert Humphrey went head-to-head for the Democratic primary spot for the 1969 presidential elections. Herbert H. Humphrey ended up being the Democratic candidate. He went against the Republican Richard M. Nixon and American Independent candidate George C. Wallace. Richard Nixon ends up winning both electoral and popular votes, making him the president of 1969. As president now, Nixon starts to pull out American troops because the war was going nowhere. Henry Kissinger, a national security advisor, helped Nixon design the Vietnamization plan. This called for a gradual withdrawal of U.S. troops in order for South Vietnamese to take more active combat roles in the war. By 1969, 25,000 U.S. troops came home. Over the next 3 years, less than 25,000 U.S. troops remained in Vietnam. The Maylee massacre and U.S. platoon had massacred innocent civilians in the village of Maylee. More than 200 Vietnamese, mostly women, children, and elderly, died. The U.S. platoon was looking for spies in the village and could not figure out who they were. After this announcement of the Maylee massacre, President Nixon told the world about the invasion of Cambodia, causing the college students across America to protest. This was the first general student strike in the nation's history. After all this came out, the Pentagon Papers were leaked. These papers showed that America had planned on entering the war even when President Johnson promised he would not. They also showed that America never planned to end the war as long as the North had control. Finally, the war ends. The longest war in American history ends with Nixon making peace with the North. But that never actually happened. The North attacked again, but this time America only gave economic aid, no troops. War leaves a horrible taste in America's mouth. This war caused many problems, and we've lost many. 58,000 Americans dead, with 303,000 wounded. On top of that, 15% of the 3.3 million soldiers that served suffered from PTSD, nightmares of war, headaches, and memory lapses. Also, many of these Vietnam veterans committed suicide, abused drugs or alcohol, and lastly, they were put in mental asylums. This war was pointless, but it made us focus on our mental health side of our soldiers more.